Welcome to Blind Men and an Elephant. These are your hosts, Neeraj and Osho.
This is a podcast where two friends discuss a whole host of ideas that range from across the spectrum, from economics to culture, politics to sport. And we hope to bring our fresh perspective to things that are happening around us.
We live in times where there is an information overload. So this is our attempt to make some sense of the noise.
You can listen to us on all major podcast streaming apps and, of course, on YouTube. You can check out all our links in the description along with this episode. Welcome everyone to episode 3 of Blind Men and the Elephant. These are your hosts, Osho and Neeraj. We have a very special guest today with us.
Tasneem Karodia, our old friend, who I used to work with, and Osho and I got to know her very well at one point of time in our lives, and we think she has a lot of interesting things to share with us. So here goes. Tasneem, say hi to all our listeners.
Hi, super excited to be here. This is amazing. I really love what you guys do.
Amazing. So Tasneem, before we dive into it, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? Like just about where you grew up, where you are now, what defines you as a person, whatever you want to say.
Awesome. So yeah, my name is Tasneem. I'm from South Africa and I'm currently based in South Africa. Born and raised, if anyone is familiar with South African geography, along the coast, Port Elizabeth. I grew up there because my dad worked at VW. I've moved to Cape Town to study and I did finance and accounting, which for most people sounds a bit boring. For me, it was quite interesting. I then went on to work in management consulting, and that's kind of also how I know Neeraj. Worked there, actually just resigned about 3 weeks ago, so quite a new place that I'm in. I've worked throughout Africa as well as India, and then most recently Finland. I've actually just gotten back about 3 months ago. And that's a bit about me in terms of, things that interest me. I love the outdoors and traveling, which is also why this job was quite convenient. And yeah, I've also recently wanted to develop more of my passion for sustainability. That's why I've recently resigned, to kind of pursue that a bit more. And that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Well, that's a lot about one person, and we'll probably get into a lot of these aspects all through our conversation. But Tasneem, why don't you tell us something about your background in terms of growing up as a person of Indian origin in South Africa? I mean, we read a lot about Indian origin people in America, in Britain, in Australia. But India and South Africa have had a lot of interpersonal relations through many centuries. So, a lot of people will be interested in how somebody of an Indian origin, like, what's the life like in South Africa? And is it something, is that identity something, which is a defining part of your life, at least when growing up?
Absolutely. I do think it is quite interesting. I think we do hear a lot about Indians elsewhere. I think in the States in particular, it is something that's more prominent. For South Africans, not so much, or you don't hear about it. But the most fascinating part of that, which is also quite interesting, is that for a long time, the Indian diaspora from South Africa was the largest. There was the largest population of Indians outside of India in South Africa. So it is quite interesting that we don't hear about it. For me, I'm a third generation South African.
Oh, wow.
And so even my parents were born in South Africa. And it is quite different. And I think for Indians in South Africa, especially being someone third generation, it differs greatly. My parents, there's a huge Indian population in a city in South Africa called Durban. My parents, most people came through that because there's also a port. So when they came from India, that's where a lot of people landed up staying. My parents, my parents' family left that area. So we kind of moved along the coast as well. And that's also why I'm from Port Elizabeth. So my family is kind of from all over. for me, it was quite different. The place that I landed up growing up was not Indian centric. And so, part of that, part of my identity does not necessarily translate as well to Indian, although I do look Indian. It's not a massive part of my identity, as Neeraj and Rosha knows. But what I will say is that I do have friends that are South African Indians as well, and they're also probably third generation, but when they've also come from different areas, and for them, they have a larger part of their identity that is associated. And I think also some of that comes down to religion. So some of my friends are Hindu, and they still have family and ties back to India and travel back to India. My family is Muslim, and so don't have as strong ties back there. And growing up in a city that wasn't as heavily populated by Indians meant that they lost some of that in a way. And so it is quite interesting because you meet a lot of people, and looks wise, I look a certain way, I speak a certain way, as you can probably hear. And so it does, South Africa is unique in that way, in that it's a cultural melting pot. And so you do kind of, you pick up certain things. I'm Indian in a lot of ways, but I'm also not Indian in a lot of ways. And it was quite interesting for me also. I lived in India for 6 months. And so, I look like I fit in, but there's a lot of parts, even if I didn't speak to people, they noticed I was a foreigner immediately. And I thought that, for me was actually really interesting coming to a country where I feel a strong tie despite not having familial ties, and yet can still feel like an outsider in a way. So it was I think it's quite interesting to also be someone that's like from somewhere but not really.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, what really struck me, I remember it was one of the first few conversations we had. I don't know if you remember that, but you mentioned to me that you were basically like the first person in your entire family to actually come to India and visit. From at least like the generations that were around you or you grew up around. So I found that very very interesting, right? Because of all the factors you mentioned, where you have such a strong tie to the culture, etc., and you actually decided to make the move to actually be that first person in your family to make your way to India, and maybe sort of I don't know, was it exploring your roots, or was it just yet another country you just wanted to take off? How did that come to happen?
Yeah, I think for me it was something that I've always been interested in, and I was interested in India because it is cultural. It's seemed really beautiful. I've seen pictures. I like traveling, and so India was always like an appealing place. But coming from South Africa, some parts of me felt Indian, but like also couldn't place that they were Indian, let's rather say. I think it does come up a lot, basically. It's like, well, you're obviously Indian. You identify as a third generation South African, but obviously with strong Indian ties. And yet, you don't have family that goes back. And so, but my family don't identify as Indian in a lot of ways. It's like, no, we're South African. And if you dig deep, eventually you'll get to like, no, well, yes, obviously, our family did come from India. For me, it just felt like a place that I did want to visit. And I do think it's important to understand heritage, even though I don't have family in India. It felt important to me to go to a place that, I have a lot of friends that are from there. Some part of my heritage is from there, even if I can't find it or feel it. It was important for me to go. And yeah, in terms of my family, I do think it's quite interesting. I think that is what's unique about South Africa, is that we have, again, I go back to, it's a cultural melting pot. So in terms of apartheid, my family grew up in this very different environment where, your immediate focus is on being segregated or being ostracized, not necessarily your cultural ties back to a different country that you're not in. And so for them, they grew up in this environment where they weren't necessarily thinking about that culture. And so the way they identify is more South African and more related to other things in the country as opposed to that. And so it is quite interesting that I was the first person to go to India. But it's also because my family grew up in this like very, very different environment. I grew up in a more privileged environment where I was given the opportunity to like enable me to explore that side of my culture. And so one of the first things I did like after I left India, because it was more of a possibility once I left India, was to actually do a genetic test.
Oh.
Because my family don't actually, my family never kept close ties with the rest of their family. So our extended family is also quite unknown. And I, like, for a large part of my life, I didn't actually know even where in India I was from. And so I think also there was this disconnect. My family had this, and this is also why I was the first person to go to India, basically, in our family, is like disconnect between being able to even connect with their culture because there was so many other things going on in their life. And I had the opportunity to actually explore that, which I have done, which I've also found quite interesting. And in case interesting for you, it's like I'm mostly like a Gujarati, basically.
That's really fascinating to know. And the thing is that we often see that people from older generations have this need to connect back to their cultural roots and heritage, whereas people from our generation often like to identify themselves more and more with the place that they've grown up at. But here we see something completely different, in that your parents were in fact reluctant to um, come back to India, or I even identify themselves as Indian, but you wanted to sort of explore those roots so much so that you wanted to get a genetic test done. So, how do you explain this sort of role reversal, if I may?
Also, before we get into the
I,
seriousness of things, let me just add that we often make a joke that Tasneem is older than us and therefore not belonging to our generation. But we're going to let that go for this one, and we're going to let you answer again, Tasneem. Over.
much older, sure. Also, we're still both from Gen X, just in case. It is quite a broad generation.
I thought we were
But to
all
actually
millennials.
answer your
Hello.
question, oh, fuck,
No?
we are. Like, yeah, we all. I'm obviously between generations. You know what? I accept. I am much older. Okay, you're right. But to answer your actual question, I think a large part of it actually goes down to just the environment that my specific family grew up in. So also goes straight back to apartheid because that did have a major influence on my specific family situation. For example, my dad's family was, based on segregation laws that were put in place. They were forcibly removed from the area that they lived. Eventually, they found themselves in, the town that I landed up being born in, which is called Uitenhage. And what that meant was that wasn't a massive Indian population. My family had kind of lost ties with their family. And I think this does happen to a lot of like immigrants in a certain way, which is like, I think similar to some people in America, they don't necessarily know their full heritage. And so it kind of been lost during, generations of coming in, having been subjected to things like apartheid, forcibly removed. And so for my parents, they grew up in this environment where it's like their culture wasn't known to them, and so they developed their own culture.
Do you
They
think,
grew up in areas where there weren't that many Indian people,
sorry, do you think this is,
and that had an impact.
do you think this was, do you think this was like was this like a strategy? Like, was this something that the South African system at that point did, that you would be cut off from your community, especially with Indian Americans? Is that what happened?
I don't think it was as intentional, but I do think some of it played a role. For example, when one of the main things, and I think this is something that like not a lot of people know, is my surname is Karodia, that Neeraj mentioned earlier, but that's not my actual family surname. When people were coming from India on boats to South Africa, there's a language that's spoken in South Africa, and that's Afrikaans, and that's of Dutch descent. There's and one of the main things is like there's a word that's called fun, and they were told, people on the boats that were coming from India to South Africa were told, by the way, when you get asked the word fun, it means basically where are you from.
Okay.
But the word fun has another definition. It actually also means what is your surname. And so when people got
Oh.
asked that question, they most people obviously said basically, oh, they're asking me where I'm from. And so a bunch of people got given the surname Karodia. And so that doesn't even necessarily mean if we're a Karodia, we're actually family. We're probably from the same place. Now, to be honest, there aren't actually that many Karodias out there because it was quite a small, it is, I think, still quite a small place actually in India. And I'm pretty sure no one knows it, but it does actually exist. I found it on a map. But that also kind of helped influence those things. And when people came over, some of them also came like just with their spouse or, very small family units, which also played a role, not necessarily intentionally, but it did influence it. But I do think that, the segregation acts played more of a role in that way of separating people and isolating them in a lot of ways, though. So I go back to also where in South Africa you landed up moving. A bunch of people that are still in Durban or in Indian communities, whereas my family started moving around a lot. We actually do have some family in India, but they're not close because we got separated by a bunch of stuff, and then we didn't keep those ties. And that could also go down to own personal preference, but it became quite difficult to keep the ties to that family, and we kind of lost that connection, which is, but I wouldn't say it's the standard. I've met people that have very strong ties, lots of family, and even familial ties back to India. I had one family that they also live in the coast. They don't live in Durban, they live in East London, but their family would go back to India once a year.
Oh, wow.
And they've been doing that for years.
Wow.
And so it's so varied, it's very hard to say. And so you do get different Indians, but even my Indian friends in South Africa is like, you're not that Indian. Like, so like there are also standards even within South Africa. I know in India there was a joke, but like even here there is also a separation between people that have the familial tie don't necessarily, but it varies.
You know what I was reminded by when you said all of this is this interview that I heard of Gupta, the Gupta fellow who got caught in that scam in South Africa, if you remember, Tasneem.
I do remember. I never once actually said Gupta. I just want to be clear. I never
Sorry?
mentioned Gupta.
You didn't mention
I never
Gupta.
said Gupta.
No, you didn't. You didn't say Gupta, but I remember this interview I once
Oh.
watched of Gupta. I watched this interview of Gupta, and I distinctly remember that he had this very particular North Indian accent, and he also explained his whole rags to riches story as a way of defending himself, and how he came from this really small village in UP and sort of made it big in South Africa. And I just couldn't help but wonder that, a lot of Indian origin people in South Africa like still have those kinds of strong ties with people back home.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And I think it does vary. And because of the South African climate, it's very hard to say how it's going to vary person by person. And, it also, I think, also depends on then what kind of after apartheid, what's happened and what was allowed to be done by people. So some people were able to like gain financial independence, and so they kind of carried on in a certain way, whereas like some people weren't able to do that and felt victim to a lot of the policies that were in the country. So it does vary. The Guptas are not a great example and not like the best example, but I do agree. It's like there are people that were prosperous because of certain things and still had those like ties. They have subsequently left South Africa just as an FYI.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yes,
Well,
a lot of them after multiple scandals that I'll let people Google rather than tell you about. A bunch
well,
of them were able to leave the country.
Oh wow.
Well, classic Osho stirring up controversy aside, no, that's a fascinating insight, Tasneem. Honestly, having known you for all this while and having spent so much quality time while we worked together in Delhi, it's really fascinating to hear this side of the story. And I mean, as they say, right? You learn every single day.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing this with us. Just to sort of draw a parallel to and talk about your career, right? Just to give our listeners a little bit of a background, I know I haven't done this introduction before, and I will at some point of time in this podcast. But I used to work in management consulting for about 4 years, and our, our office was in Delhi, and this office used to get international transfers every once in a while. So these were people who used to come from other offices abroad and work there for periods of 3 months, 6 months, and so on. So Tasneem, incidentally, happened to be one of these transfers, and probably one of the main reasons why we ended up becoming friends was because our desks were so close. And I mean, no regrets there, right? Like, that was amazing. But Tasneem, do you want to tell our listeners who may not know what the world of management consulting is, what that means, and what does it entail to be a management consultant?
Absolutely. Um, One thing I will say is like he may be happy about the desk being so close, maybe not me so much. But it
Wow,
did lead me to be
thanks.
on this podcast, so good for everyone else, maybe. No, I'm just kidding. But in terms of management consulting, I think maybe I'll just start with why I kind of joined and then tell you a little bit about it. For me, I mentioned earlier I studied finance and accounting, and although I liked what I studied, I didn't really want to be, a banker or an accountant for that fact. And so it was one of the things I started exploring is what can I do with this very kind of specific degree? What would I do with it? And one of the main things that I started seeing was like consulting was this avenue to get exponential learning across industries. You don't necessarily specialize. You can kind of jump around from a project to a project, learn about clients, and then kind of just move on. And being in a bigger firm, you also get this travel opportunity. So all of that kind of sounded appealing to my like 22, 23-year-old self. And so I joined our office in Joburg. And it was just that. It's management consulting is basically businesses come to consultants. They have a business related problem, and it can range from very operational performance improvement type of questions where like losing money, what do we do, all the way to a very high level strategy. What should our 50-year strategy be going forward? And so it's diverse and it's interesting. And because we're quite a big firm, we get to work with large companies. So people that, have big companies, have a lot of employees, and it can be really, really interesting. For me, I did enjoy it. I did, as I said, I just recently resigned, but I did 6 years of it. And no project was ever the same. I sometimes worked in the same industry, but not really. But geography was also kind of working in Africa, being from South Africa. We worked across Africa, so it became quite interesting for me. And that's kind of like the gist of it. I spent 6 years there. I could talk for a while, but I'll just kind of end it there. It's one of the places that people say, if you don't know what you do, you kind of get into consulting because it's a way to kind of figure out what do you like, because you get to jump around from industry
Amen to
to
that.
kind of capability.
Yeah, amen to that. No, I think you summed it up really well. Another way I like to think of this, and please tell me if you disagree. I think I like, to my uninitiated friends, I just say, of course, while giving ourselves a lot of importance, I say that we're like doctors to companies. We they come to us with their problems, and we basically prescribe solutions. Would you go so far as to say that?
Basically, I think that sums it up, perfectly. Um, Although no one dies on our job.
See, knowing Neeraj, I think one one kind of skill that you require as a consultant is to BS with confidence. But that joke aside, what do you think? What do you think are the skills that you require and you pick up on this job?
Absolutely. So I think one of the main things that people look for when they're hiring for people in management consulting, the biggest thing, especially like being a person that I've understood where the interviews go, and I've chatted to a lot of people that are starting to apply, is coachability. And it's just like making sure that people can be coached. You may not have all the right skills, and I don't think in any job you ever have all the right skills. You learn as you go. But can I sit with you and understand what you're doing wrong and tell you what you're doing wrong, and then you fix it the next time? That's the most important thing. And we test it in a various ways during interviews. The other things that are like kind of core, but as long as you kind of have coachability, are not as critical, is like you do have to have some kind of analytical brain, problem solving. And so can you do, and also doing basic maths. But once you have those things, as long as you're also quite personable and friendly, you work really long hours in teams. And so if people aren't going to get along with you and you're not going to be able to be coached, it really doesn't work. So that's like initially what you need. Going forward, what you learn is an immense amount. I think a lot of it, if I can distill, really comes down to communication. I think people are quite surprised when, that's the kind of the response I give. But a lot of people don't actually know how to communicate with effect. And that's a lot of what we land up doing. A lot of my job in terms of output landed up being slides. But it really came down to how do you communicate? How do we get the message across? And how do you drive people to action? Because a lot of time we would figure out what the problem is, but we really wanted to get people to do something and make the change to fix the problem. And so it came down to communication. So if I can distill the one thing you learn how to communicate, but you learn how to communicate in a various ways and how to drive people to do things in a very, very meaningful way. But Neeraj also worked in this space. So like, would love to hear what else you think.
All I'm going to say is underline, bold, and italics the word long hours. For now, I think that's good.
But actually, Tasneem, actually, I wanted to know if you had like, if there was one example you could give to illustrate this point about communication and getting people to do things that they wouldn't understand or wouldn't be able to without your intervention, what would that be?
In terms of example, I mean, I think more recently I've just started working in a startup, and I want to bring this example in because I think it's just like, in a consulting environment, it's one thing. You're working with people that understand the way you work, but when you move outside of that job and start to work in what I would call the real world, quote unquote, it's very different environment. And I've only really recently started to understand what value we as ex-consultants bring to the table. And we had, for example, a recent meeting with, the co-founders and CEO, and they had a disagreement about what first slide to use in a presentation. And for me, it was like, I don't actually understand what the problem is. Also, why are we sitting 30 minutes on a call to discuss this?
Yeah.
And throughout the day, it was like back and forth emails, back and forth messages. This is the problem. This is the problem. And, and then I was like, you know what? I suggest we get on a call. And through that, it was like, let's understand the problem. And, when to kind of let people speak, and when to cut people off, and when to inflate people's egos, and when to stop them because they have an inflated ego. And so I was like, we're going to do a 10-minute call. We are trying to resolve to take everyone's day up. Let's do this in 10 minutes. I understand what you're saying, but what is the outcome we're trying to achieve? Can we agree on that? And so for me, it was like, let's align on what we're all trying to achieve. And once everyone agreed upon that, they were like, oh, yes, no, that makes sense. Then this is the option we should go for. And so it was like this very interesting example of a whole day spent But the fact that I could just drive them to get onto a call at the end of the day, 10 minutes, resolve it, I think was a good example of just like when you can get to the bottom of the issue quick, we could resolve it quite easily. And that seems like a trivial example, but it wasted 5 people's days, an entire day.
Wow.
Yeah, no, that sounds, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me as well. I've seen this in action all the time, especially after you leave the world of consulting, like how some things that you think that are super obvious may not be so, and then you have to make sure you package things in a certain way which makes it as obvious as things are to you. So I absolutely resonate with what you just said. One last point on consulting, Tasneem, is something you touched upon earlier, which is you get the opportunity to work in different countries and different cultures. I'm sure there are like countless learnings on that, and you could go on. But if I had to ask you to sum up the 3 things that would say define you interacting with any new culture or any new environment, and what maybe consulting has taught you or what you knew beforehand, what are the 3 things that come to mind when you think of aligning with different cultures?
I think the key is, for me, I found, is just like having vulnerability. I think recognizing that when you move or change cultures, there's something that you don't know or don't understand, and having vulnerability to, one, be open about your ignorances, and two, being open to understanding other people. So I suppose one is vulnerability, and the second one is probably openness to learn. I would probably distill it into 2, maybe not 3. And I think that's kind of like just helped me move around a lot, is just is those 2 things. And I think it's critical, because if you do want to be friends with other people, it's really, really opening yourself up to that, giving more of yourself as well. So it's also mutually beneficial, but also mutually respectful, because I think that's also where a lot of things kind of like fall apart when it comes to clashes of culture.
Have you had any major issues or conflicts because of this? Because people either expected something differently from you, or you didn't understand, or like the other person wasn't clear because of some cultural context, or some just how things are done in some countries. Because in India, like in India, I'm sure you would have experienced that there's a lot of, I don't know, people cutting corners. There's a lot of like peculiar ways in which people do things. So not India specific, but just generally, if there's any conflict, anything you'd want to talk about in that regard.
What I will say is just I didn't necessarily see Indians cutting corners. My experience was very positive. My team worked extremely hard and
It
really
was just
well.
Osho,
But in
Tasneem.
terms
It's
of
just Osho. That's corners. Anyway.
okay, well, I'm glad then I only worked with you and not with him. But I
Yes.
think
Podcast, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in.
there've definitely been culture clashes. I think the benefit of working for this global company like that I've worked for is that even when I've been based in South Africa, I've worked with people from different cultures. But one of the main things that I've recently experienced was when I was working in Finland. Despite working in Finland or in the Nordics, I was actually working with someone from Germany. And I do think it's one of the key things for me was just, it comes down to communication and expectations, and just really trying to align on those up front. From a German aspect, there's definitely a different type of work ethic. And I'm not saying I don't work hard, but their expectation of what working hard means translated into hours. And for me, it was no. Getting the work done in a smart, efficient way to get to the same output. I don't have to be here for 16 hours. I can do the same amount, but we need to agree on that up front. And so it was really, really understanding, we often talked past one another. But I think, to overcome that, it also still goes down to communication. I think after 2 or 3 painful weeks, I was like, it's going to be unbearable if we continue in this way, because I was getting frustrated, he was getting frustrated. And eventually we just both had a conversation where we were quite frank with one another. Ultimately, we were trying to achieve the same thing. But, it really came down to communication and really trying to put myself in their shoes and understand their frustration as well. And so, but it definitely does happen. But I do think it's like best to get ahead of it. My main goal is like there'll be cultural clashes. It can also be personality clashes, and I think you can apply that even if you're working with people from the same culture. There'll still be different types of personalities, and getting ahead of it is quite important to avoid the frustration that comes with it. And I think again, it comes down to communication. Let's be open and honest and direct, and understand the situation, and then move past it.
Well said. Tasneem, now we've touched upon you moving across cultures, across different countries, and working in different places. If I were to ask you, like, aside from work, right? You've traveled to countries like Mauritania, you worked in the Nordics, you've moved across Europe, you've gone to the US, you've worked in India. What did you like about that whole experience? And how did that broaden your horizons, right? And what is it that you take back from some of these experiences? Like, just summed up, like, what are the first things that come to your mind? And is there any kind of special connection you feel to some of these places?
I mean, I think there's a lot there, and I can say a lot. But what I will say is, for me, I've really felt quite privileged and lucky to be able to do all those things. It's allowed me to see the world in a very different way. Traveling personally versus living somewhere has, given me a whole lot of different perspectives. So for me, it's been wonderful and enjoyable in a lot of ways. And it's just, I think when you move outside of your comfort zone, which is a lot of what happens in these places, especially like a place like Mauritania, it forces you to really reflect on your personality, your values, and how you kind of derive joy. So for example, Mauritania, I worked on a mine for 4 months. The mine was at least
Wow.
6 hours from the nearest city, and it was a mine that was, I'm female and I identify as female, but it was a mine with probably 99.9% males.
Oh no.
And so it's a very different environment, but it does force you to kind of, you know, reflect on yourself and what's important to you. And for me, I had a really good team, so I ended up enjoying that experience. And I think, I could have easily have gone into that being like, this is really crap. It's in the desert. It's like 40 degrees plus. I had to wear, a long sleeve top and pants to go for a run in the evenings. And being quite isolated, it was a very different environment. But I
Wow.
ended up enjoying it because I was able to take enjoyment in the small things. We had a catering company that baked their own bread. The other food was terrible, but the bread was phenomenal.
Wow. The little joys.
And the little joys in life, which is just like, if you can find those in places where there are hardship, I do think you can go and adapt quite easily. My team was also really phenomenal. And so, despite having to spend 24/7 with them, which can irritate anyone, and I was probably irritating to them too, they were still a great team. And so for me, I learned a lot about myself because I've also like spent a lot more time with myself. And I think there's a real joy in knowing yourself a lot and being comfortable in that way, which is what a lot of this experience has taught me. And it really has allowed me to also be just very open to opportunities and people and understanding other people. And so I am quite grateful for that opportunity. I would say, like, if anyone else ever like is worried about it, it's just like, it's hard, but it's definitely worthwhile if you put yourself through the effort it requires, because I've learned so much that it's honestly, what I've learned is unquantifiable in the value that I feel from it.
Have you ever felt that you'd rather be put in one base, in one stable place where you just not have to worry about living out of a suitcase for a year, 2 years, and keep jumping from place to place, continent to continent?
Absolutely. I think part of also my reason for leaving and quitting was that I wanted to start to establish a home base. I started to think about what is important for me. And, one of the things that, honestly speaking, is actually finding a partner in life and jumping around. It was quite hard. I felt it quite easy to settle in and make some friends and do things and have fun. But it was harder to find, someone that I was compatible with because, how do I do that? And what do I now want and value? And just as Nira just pointed out, I am older. Kind of having something more settled is important to me. And so it is something that I have thought about and I am doing. The other thing I will just say to one of your points is just like, how does it feel like jumping about and living out of a suitcase? To be honest, I've never lived out of a suitcase. I think what's very important for me is wherever I go, no matter how short, I always unpack. And so making sure that I kind of feel a little bit at home is very important so that you don't feel like you're just jumping about. One of the best advice and actually best gift I ever got from a friend of mine was she gave me a fridge magnet and she wrote a note and she told me, no matter where you go, at least find a way to make it a home because that'll make it so much better. And it was true. It made me feel settled wherever I was, and it made me want to commit to at least however long I was there, commit to fully being there. And I think that's important. But I do think, as I go back to now, I want to feel a little bit more settled just so I could find a partner, basically.
Wow, that's so beautiful. Yeah, I think what your friend did was also so it's as we said before, it's the small things. And yeah, I think it is, home is what you make of it. And yeah, I think that's a great idea. And what you said about unpacking, it really makes a lot of sense. That's actually something that I'll definitely recommend to any of my friends who ever feel homesick in the future. That's beautiful. So Tasneem, since we're on the topic of friends, how do you manage your relationships across all these borders, right? Like, how do you ensure you're still in touch with people and so on? Because I know you as a person, and you're not like huge on social media and stuff like that. So how do you make sure you're always there for the moments? How do you make sure that you're still in touch with your near and dear ones?
I've moved around a lot, so not just with my job, but I also went to study in a city that was far away from home. And I think early on I realized that there was a disconnect between let's say my family and me and how I was feeling connected to them. And so I started, I don't think it was ever intentional, but I started kind of enforcing time for my family. And at some point, I started scheduling time with my family, which when I got to India, a lot of people actually laughed at. I was like, and well, mostly like Neeraj was laughing every time. He's like, well, should we do something? And I was like, no, I still have the call with my brother every Tuesday at 7 p.m. So just so you know, like that's still a thing that happens. And so I started doing some of that quite early on, but I've tried to still keep that going on, especially with my family, especially moving around a lot when they're in one place and I'm not, and it felt quite weird. And so I've got standing weekly calls with my brother and my sister, and then I kind of reminders for like, probably should call dad, probably should call mom. But with my friends, which is slightly different because I don't communicate as much, I do try and like, make sure that I think you have to be intentional. And so who are the people, you can't keep in touch with every single person and you can't have the same level of relationship with every single person. But because I have moved around a lot, I do have, and I've had friends that have moved around a lot. A lot of people are not in the same place as me. And so for me, I'm quite intentional about, when I think of someone or something, strikes me about someone, I will message them and ask them how they're doing. They should probably try and give them a call or message them to try and make a call. And there are some people that I speak to a little bit more regularly, and then there's some people that it's like every 2 to 3 months I'll probably like set a reminder that I should just like reach out to them. And it sounds like methodical and a bit like I'm a psychopath, but I think it helps me stay connected because they're important to me, and so I want to also make sure that I make the time for it. But life gets in the way, and so if I don't have those things, it can just get in the way of me interacting with the very, very important people in my life.
Yeah, no, I mean, jokes aside, it sounds wonderful, this system, because I think you said it beautifully when you said it's you have to be intentional. I think that solves a lot of problems that distance, etc., might bring in any kind of relationships,
Yeah,
and especially just making sure you're there for people when they need you, when you need them, and just having those regular check-ins. I think that's not very hard, and I think in fact, I think you being off social media, I think helps you be more intentional like that. So I think it's a very good system you've got there.
it also prevents people from taking each other for granted, because one would just think, it doesn't matter if I don't take this call, it doesn't matter if I don't take this one step in order to reach out, but then that one missed step probably, keeps piling up. But this way, it's great that you're always on top of these relationships.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I also don't, not that good, but it does. I do feel like also one of the other things is just like also birthday reminders. It's like when I know someone's birthday, it's set as a reminder in my calendar. And it's also then at least some people that I don't speak to as often, it's one of the things that it's just like on that day, then at least I'm connecting with them and like making sure that they also feel important. Because I think these days people are off Facebook and it's not even a thing anymore. And so now you do have to be more intentional. And I do feel quite connected to people, and the relationships that I want to make work are, I put effort in, and I feel it reciprocated. I think once people see effort, they also put it in, and so not all of it is one-sided. So it's not like I have to be the only one that ever messages. It's like once people feel like they mean something to you, they start also putting more effort in, and so it also becomes easier as you do it over time.
But, before we let you go, we have to ask you, how is your flying going? How is that pilot course going?
And to the uninitiated listener, guys, we've left the best for last, I think, because Tasneem one day dropped this truth bomb on us and said that, oh, you know what? I'm also learning flying. I'm training to be a pilot, and this is like a part-time hobby. So yeah, how's that going, Tasneem, and how did that come about?
It's going well. I would love to say that I'm done, but I'm still about a month away. And so working at Bain, it's been quite hard to actually finish. But what I will say is there are 8 exams. I've done 5 of them. I've done all my hours, and so I'm close. Very close. And I will let you know when I'm finished.
You can just drop by.
Yeah, just drop by. Don't let us know.
Okay, I'll definitely do that. When COVID's done, that's what I'll do.
Okay, so Tasneem, now that we've held you on for long enough, I think we're gonna finally let you go. But before we go, is there anything you would like to say to our listeners?
I'd like to say thanks. Thanks for your time. I hope that at least there's something valuable that I've said. One of the main things I will say is like stay safe and please like, share, subscribe. Thank you.
Okay, guys. This is Blind Man and the Elephant, and this is episode 3.
Thank you.